We had the Ag Agency in last week to give some testimony on H-167 and talked a little bit about how the funding would move through the agency and then on to the food bank. They had some questions largely around resources, internal resources, and we had some questions about how does it work in other instances where there are grants that effectively are just passing through, that the agency does have a certain amount of work that it has to do for compliance purposes, reporting purposes. Anyway, so we asked Mike to come in so that we can look at the bill, mark it up, or at least think about where we need to make some changes. And Mike has been briefed on that testimony from last week. So, Mike, do you want to take it from there?
This is Mike O'Grady with Legislative Counsel. First, before I go into the chair's question, I wanted to note when I walked through the bill originally, I flagged a potential constitutional issue with the Dormant Commerce Clause and whether or not the bill was discriminatory. You asked me to contact a constitutional law expert that I know, and he indicated that it is not an issue. It is more like a direct subsidy by the state for a local interest, and those have been held to be constitutional. And it's not as attenuated as some of the other bills you might see where basically the government is trying to regulate in a discriminatory way. So it's not an issue. And he was very helpful, Brandon Denning.
Can you just say thank you for checking with him and appreciate his input. Can you just remind us what the Dormant Commerce Clause is and why it might have been a problem?
Sure. So under the federal constitution, the federal government regulates commerce between the states. The states can regulate commerce, but they have to do it in a way that is non-discriminatory to out-of-state commerce. There are certain exceptions to that. One of those exceptions is when the state is operating as what's called a market participant, when they are buying for themselves, or when they are subsidizing direct subsidies for local preferences or what you might say are discriminatory preferences. Those are okay. The courts have said that that's all right, that that's effectively the state acting as a purchaser, and any purchaser has the ability to make those types of decisions within some limitations. But for the purposes of this is, according to Brandon, a direct subsidy or just slightly attenuated so that it wouldn't be raising a constitutional issue.
And it's Vermonters feeding Vermonters. So the bill envisions money that would support Vermont growers. And that's where the question came up.
Where the question comes up is the definition of local food. And the definition of local food is definitely focused almost entirely on Vermont products.
And clause, you're talking, what's that called?
Commerce Clause? Dormant commerce. There isn't actually a thing called the dormant. There isn't a dormant commerce clause. It's just a legal principle to explain when a state is regulating in commerce, how they can do it without violating Canada's constitution. So I am a little sorry that I raised the issue because Brandon was like, oh, so cavalier in saying that it was not cavalier. He was so quick to say that it was constitutional. Then the question that the chair had about administration of grants, the Agency of Ag has people that do grants, whether it's a water quality grant or in the development division. They have people that's largely a part of their job. But whenever an agency staff or any state agency staffer is filling out their time, they have to code for their time and code to the source of the funds for that time. And I expect that the agency is saying when they dedicate someone to do this program and do the due diligence, because there is a administrative bulletin that the agencies need to follow. And when they are issuing a grant, they will have to still follow that bulletin. They will still need to have some, basically some accountability from the food bank for the grant. The food bank won't get the entire grant up front. The state holds back a little bit usually, so that they can ensure that the grantee is implementing the grant as directed. So that time for that agency employee, the agency wants to be compensated for it. They don't want to try to find it somewhere else in their budget. And I think that's a very easy thing to address in the appropriation. You can say that the agency can use a certain amount of that $2 million for administrative purposes. And that's a very common condition on an appropriation such as this. The question then becomes, how much? You can set a percentage or you can set a specific amount that you think is reasonable. I've just literally been drafting a bill that's going back and forth between the two. You know, $62,000. No, it should be 10%. No, it should be 5%. No, it should be 70,000. You know, it's like that's the discussion that you can have amongst yourself and with the agency about what would they need.
Representative Balsam.
Is there sort of an expected number for that? I mean, I recall in places that have been where they had like a fiscal agent for something, it often was 10%. I mean, like, is there a number that if we were to pick a quintessential average estimate?
I think your first question is, do you need enough to fund a full-time employee?
Mhm.
And that would be right now what they're budgeting out is $125,000 for that.
Do you think we'd need a full employee for this?
I don't think so. So then the question is, how much time do you think a full-time employee would spend on this grant? And then how do you account for that?
Representative Nelson.
Is this something you'd put in? Maybe like you'd say up to an
Yeah.
amount,
Yes,
up to an amount.
yes. Up to a percentage or up to a specific dollar amount. That's usually how it's done. When you use this, when you say they can use $70,000, they try to use $70,000, even though they might not have actually.
Exactly.
Does this, the way that it's currently proposed, does it look like anything else, any other existing grants that either this agency is charged with administering or other grants that you might be aware of that could help us think about how much time would it actually involve on the agency's part? And then we can think of what would an appropriate dollar amount be?
That's a good question. It's very targeted, which is why it's a little different. Because, for example, use Working Lands. Working Lands gets a line item every year, and the agency is by statute required to staff that and administer the grants for the board. But that process is more attenuated because you have the board and they debate and they discuss and they review the applications. And so the time spent by the agency staff in that program is likely much more than you would get in this program. And I think It's a really good question because there's usually so many more applicants, right? And you're not dealing with the applicants here because the food bank's going to deal with the applicants. They're the ones that are going to be issuing the sub grants. So I don't have a great one-to-one.
Representative Balsam?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we had testimony on this, there was a question of if it needed to go to the Agency of Agriculture at all, or could we just make the bill so that the money goes to the food bank and they have to deal with all that stuff?
Well, normally, I say normally, you pass money through a state agency and for this type of program.
Does it have to be though?
Well, it's not a have to, but it's good fiduciary requirement so that there is oversight of how the grant is being implemented. Remember, the auditor will come in and audit the agency programs, including their grant programs, and the agency gets really anxious when that happens. And they want to be doing things appropriately. And so moving money through the agency it serves that purpose of the fiduciary responsibility. It also, and this might be a bigger purpose of this bill, this could entrench this grant as part of the agency's base budget. And so instead of the food bank coming in every year and trying to be assertive about what they should receive in a line item, that they are in the budget. And then it's up to you, similar to what you do with working lands, to say, oh, working lands should get more or less, or et cetera. And so it's an ongoing expectation for you of what the budget will include. And I don't know if that's the food bank's intent or the intent of the sponsor, but I think that will be an important result.
Representative Burke?
I know, I think I forgot my question in the meantime listening, so I'll come back to it.
Okay, all right. Raise your hand as soon as you remember it and we'll.
Yeah, oh, yeah, thank
Representative
you.
Nelson.
I think, I wouldn't imagine it would take more than a half FTE. Matter of fact, I could see it because the food bank will be administering the sub grants. They'll be just reading over them and sending the money. It might only take a quarter FTE, but I have great faith in the funny shaped brick building across the street, that if we ask them what they think it'll take, they will be forthcoming, and then we can look at, when they come back to give us the report the next year, we can look at it. But I think if we put into up to an FTE, which is 67.5, theoretically covering insurance and everything else, I don't think they'd expend it, and if they did, they could say, hey, we need more on that. But they'd tell us.
Representative Burke?
Yeah, so I've received funds from essentially the same program from the food bank through the food shelf and Cabot. And it seems like they are the ones that each individual shelf kind of does most of the legwork on choosing who to give, $1,000, $2,000 to have produce brought in. So
I think that's how this program's set up.
yeah,
And going back to Representative Aslan's question, could you just give it to the food bank? Yeah, you could, because you've done that, but it's unusual. And I think it was also a product of COVID, when there was such a need and the food bank was serving such an important purpose for food security in the state, that the General Assembly kind of, might have stepped over a requirement that they might usually do.
does it also help going through the Agency of Agriculture to make the point that this is a about subsidizing local farmers.
Viability as well as just,
Like that's another component of this.
Security,
Not
yeah.
it's, you know, so that we avoid the issue potentially. The one you brought up earlier choosing who the suppliers are.
yeah, yeah. I think farm viability is a big part of this program. It's not just food security, it's, you know, providing markets for local farms.
So I'm wondering whether, just thinking about the workload on the agency and so we can come up with a number that's appropriate and acceptable. It still might mean that we're adding additional stress to the agency. If we said, for example, we don't think it's a full-time, it's not going to, this wouldn't require a full-time person. We might, agree to that. So it's a fraction of a person. They're not going to hire a fraction of a person. They're probably going to ask an existing person to do, additional work.
Well, can I just interject?
Please, yeah.
You haven't authorized a position in this.
So
So if you wanted a full-time position, you would have to authorize it, or the agency is going to have to try to find it from the pool, which is not very recommended these days. But there are things like limited service positions or half full-time. I don't know, you probably know these terms better than I do. Full-time, part-time, or something like that, that the agency might be able to get authority to hire.
So, good, good. We can find out more about that if we need to. I'm wondering as far as the reporting requirement goes. So looking up at the in section 2, subsection 2, well, talks about reports, and maybe we should go back a little bit further. I'm wondering, do we need to have the agency drafting a report? Could that be a responsibility of food bank? And maybe the agency has to sign off on it, or maybe they don't need to be tasked with that part.
You could do that. Again, the food bank is a private entity, and you normally don't require private entities to do things under law. And I say normally, you have done it all the time. But it's normally you try to avoid that. If the food bank is amenable to that, I think that's your response. And you could say the food bank, after consultation with the agency, shall provide this report. So if the agency wants to add any information, they can.
Would that satisfy auditing requirements or other?
I think the agency is going to have to maintain its own records and for the auditing purposes. I think they'll probably, as part of the grant, the initial grant to the food bank, have some conditions in that grant about information sharing, data collection, et cetera.
Okay. I mean, I'd be inclined to lean in that direction anyway. And to the extent that the food bank has, is prepared to carry that, share of the workload, minimizing whatever the agency has to do, while still keeping the agency, whole in terms of cost, but not trying to shift too much of the work onto them. So we do have the food bank here with us, and John, if you wanted to speak to any of this, that might be helpful, just so that we have an understanding of what your perspective is.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. John Sales from the Vermont Food Bank, resident of Montpelier. Just to let you know, the we have a number of grants through the state. And when we negotiate the grant agreements, we negotiate in the agency asks us to do the reporting, basically. And so we would negotiate a grant agreement with the Agency of Agriculture and they would ask us to provide the information that would go into the report to the legislature. So if that's somehow indicated in the statutory language, that's certainly fine. And just kind of an aside, as someone who's run state agencies, I certainly want the agency to get compensated for the time that they're spending. There'll be more time in the first year when you're negotiating initial grant agreement. And then if it does continue, it becomes a little smoother process year after year.
Thank you. All right,
One other small point, on page 3, line 9, it is. Vermont Food Bank Center requires to buy directly from smaller local farms or farm stands. I know, Richard, you brought up a point, like you're a large farm, but you might have 5 acres of sweet corn, right? That's a small point, but I don't know if smaller needs to be in there or not. That's something to get.
yeah, that came up the other day,
Okay.
that maybe we want to,
When we go over those little details. If that happens
no, I
now.
think this is the time, yeah.
Okay.
We wanted to not restrict it to a larger farm who just might be producing a small amount of a particular product.
I think that's-
Well, it could be someone that produces a Moses, all right, they're not a small farm. Pete's Greens is not a small farm. But they have great produce. And if they want to make a deal with the food bank to give them the best bang for their dollars, I don't think we should hamper it one bit at all. And besides, Greg, if they eat our sweet corn, they're gonna want it all because it's that good.
I mean, I see the value, I think I see what the intention is to. Because the food bank will tend to partner with larger, lower priced. Farms normally, so part of this is about buying from smaller farms that might have a price that isn't as competitive, but still. Gets, it's nice and local, it might be from the same town as the food shelf itself.
Would you want to say something like buy from local farms with the diversity of size or something?
There we go.
Yeah,
That works.
Don't be so restricted that someone like Richard with 5 acres of corn and 8,000 acres of grassland. For cattle can't participate.
Yeah, and again, I think the intent was not at all to really restrict any size farm, but to give flexibility to the
Right.
smaller partners.
Yeah, no, diversity. That works.
Okay. I do have to go to another committee, but I've heard 3 markups. I've heard the administrative purposes of the certain amount, and the number I heard was 67,000. Is that?
Yeah. I mean, if you want to, and we can confirm with the agency, but if you want to draft that change, that would be good.
I heard the change you discussed there regarding the smaller farms. And then I heard wasn't sure if you made a decision about the reporting.
I think that, yeah, it sounds like if we can, sounds like it would be not unusual for the food bank to be actually drafting the reporting, and I don't know how we want to word that, but.
Anything else?
Representative Burt?
So am I correct in hearing that is this the only statute that would be in place right now, defining an agreement between the food bank and the state agency? Or is there already statute in place that?
No, there is not
This would be the,
this would be there's session law where the food banks received appropriations and directed to use it for certain things. But this would be the first statutory going in the green books that would,
So it would be comparable in that sense to the working lands?
Yes.
There's statute that sets up that grant program. Okay, we're all good? Thanks, Mike. You can continue the conversation.
yeah, something that's my mind. Do you want a strike all or do you want an instance by instance amendment? That's fine.
It's a short bill, so probably a straight call.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Good now.
Okay. All right,
You are on, but not in the toolkit.
did anybody have any follow-up observations or discussion points on that? Bill?
I just think it makes sense to try and give as little money to the administrative process and as much money into the grants as possible. So the idea that the food bank would be managing most of it and then the agency would basically just be looking over that as opposed to creating the whole auditing system. I think that really makes sense. I mean, the more layers we add, the more we're diluting the funds that we're giving to the farmers and buying food.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Here.
given that this is the first kind of statutory relationship between food bank and the state agency. This has kind of been an idea that's I've been seeing with every association or council or entity that's linking to the state and is receiving funds is in the reporting to have, and I know, John, we talked about this last time you were here, we talked after the meeting. It's really with every, even the agency of ag itself, that in the reporting would be, maybe saying, what are ways that we've seen over the course of the year where we can make improvements. Whether that's like, if we had a staff member here, we could have this level, this kind of quality provided that we don't have right now, we're lacking in this area, or we see, this is a segment of our agency that, the values in state is decreasing, and we see like there's, what are ways that the agency has made improvements over the year, or would like to see improvements in the coming year.
So these are internal practices or?
Yeah, I mean, so like here, like with the reporting that H-167 is asking for, add another line of, what are ways to improve, this grant or this program going forward? And what are ways that you've seen, whether it's, when it comes to things like, the food bank or Department of Children and Families, how are we trying to give people like up, but not create dependency? You think, I don't know what kind of language we put into the reporting that would just look for constant improvement, like you and I were discussing.
Yeah, so I think we can, if you want to try and connect with Mike at some point.
Yeah.
Say that we had that conversation, if there's a way to add a line of language that would direct the agency to do that wouldn't be, and he can give you his opinion on this, but then we can check with the agency too, that would not add another, large amount of money to what we're actually, taking off. But yeah.
Yeah, just like one additional part of the reporting that not only says like how much money we're looking for, or, the basic structure of how it was administered, but one more of what can we do to make improvements, or what have we done to make improvements?
John, while you're here, was there anything else you wanted to say? You're welcome to come up and add to anything you've already said, or if you don't feel that's necessary, that's fine too, but.
I don't feel it's necessary. I think it's a good idea. Representative Burgess said to have in the reporting that we do, how can this program be improved? What have the broader impacts been rather than just pounds of food? So definitely open to that. And no, I appreciate the great questions from the committee and the way the bill's developed.
All right, good. Anybody have anything else? You can stop then and